and welcome to this next webinar in the Shoesmith Shared and Half series. My name is Sebastian Price. I'm a partner in Shoesmith's commercial group, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. Of course, these webinars are all about bringing in-house lawyers together to share thoughts and answer questions in a half-hour coffee break, bite-sized session with practical tips. So, as I said, I'm a commercial lawyer, and it's true that most of these, not all of them, but most of these sessions have been on topics to help you in a business sense. But we also want to be able to help you help you personally on topics that concern us all as individuals, regardless of business. And these are topics which may not necessarily impinge on us at the moment, but they will at some point. I mean, they're going to at some point, and we're also sure to know somebody where they are a current concern, and that's of course why, as a firm, we've got our personal advisory division, which is where our panel sit. And it certainly feels to me that as we've moved past the sort of just coping phase in our business lives in relation to COVID-19, you can just see in the news that lockdown is easing a lot. Well, to me, it's definitely time to think about more personal matters. And we understand how family and personal circumstances underpin everything else. So this webinar is to discuss some issues that we've seen have come up a lot over the last few months in our personal lives, to do with health, money, and also things like the situation regarding moving home. So as we go through the session, please, if you'd like to, use the Q&A function to ask any questions. We'll see if we can answer them as we go along. But equally, if you'd prefer to speak one-on-one to anybody on our panel, then our panel, they've specifically asked me to say that they'll be very happy to have a chat with you if you would like to give any of them a call. So now let me introduce the panel. Karen Stewart is a residential property partner. She's got over 20 years of experience dealing with all aspects of residential property. She focuses on higher value or more complex property matters, often involving trusts, deputyships, grants of probate, and powers of attorney. Lucy Taylor, she's a principal associate in the Court of Protection team. So she acts for individuals and families, or individuals with impaired mental capacity, to support them and their families with their financial affairs and day-to-day decision-making. And so her clients range from children who have sustained birth injuries, adults who have acquired brain injuries through accident or injury, through to older clients who, for any reason, can't look after their own affairs. And Melissa Maple, she is a partner in the Wealth Protection team. The Wealth Protection team form lifelong relationships with clients to make sure they've got in place adequate protection for dealing with their affairs in the event that they lose capacity or on death. And Melissa's team in particular has seen a surge of instructions as a direct result of COVID-19. Obviously, that's prompted people to face not only their own mortality, but that of other family members around them. So thank you very much, panel. And Melissa, perhaps I could start with you. I know I should have a will. What other sorts of things, documents, should I be thinking about having in place?
Well, good morning, everybody. I have spent 20 years in my career telling every single individual that I ever meet that they should have a will, and the statistics are still that only 1 in every 3 of us does have one. However, as Sebastian said, I have seen a huge increase in the number of instructions from people who have wanted to make sure that not only are their own documentation, is their own documentation in place given the current pandemic, but also that for their families as well. Your will obviously is a document that speaks to you, it speaks from the date of death, so it governs what happens to your estate once you've passed away. And if you don't have a will in place, you are subject to the intestacy provisions, which allow for some flexibility, but not very much. For example, children will inherit automatically at the age of 18. And the common myth has always been that, well, everything will just pass to my wife or my husband. And that also isn't the case. There are limits from a statutory point of view as to what passes. So I'm very much hoping that this will prompt people to put their documentation in place. And in addition to putting a will in place, so there are 3 key documents I advise my clients. One is a will, and the second 2 are lasting powers of attorney.
But Melissa, I know lockdown's easing, but if I can't go out, and how do I actually make a will?
So we've had to be inventive with how we take will instructions from people. We have used, to a certain extent, this format, so a sort of video call with people via WhatsApp, WebEx if it's a corporate setup, Zoom, depending on whatever people have available to them. We've still got to deal with all the same issues in terms of determining whether people have capacity to make a will or not. But actually, we have found that a face-to-face format via video has worked perfectly well to take instructions.
Okay. And if I Google will, I'm sure there's plenty of guidance. Can I do that? Can I make a will myself using Google?
Technically, everybody could make a will themselves. My advice would be not to. And the greatest number of claims that we see for wills that have not been made properly, not been executed properly, just issues with family and arguments has resulted from homemade wills. Because it seems straightforward, but actually just taking out a clause that you think isn't relevant actually can cause catastrophe at the end of the day. So my recommendation would always be to have it done properly.
Sure. So the other big thing on my mind in this situation is if I want to move house. So Karen, I guess that's a question for you. Tell us about issues in the market.
We've had many issues. Morning, everybody. During the last few months, it's obviously been extremely difficult for people to move house. The only house moves we've been able to do have been where a property has been empty. Thankfully, that has eased. One of the first things to be released actually was that for estate agents to get back into business, which we were relieved to see. And over the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen a real surge in the market, which is interesting. I think all the pent up sort of people looking on Rightmove while they've been in lockdown, people have decided to actually make a move. So the last couple of weeks, we've seen a surge in the sort of new inquiries that we've had, as well as the ones that were on ice, if you'd like to call it that, while we were in lockdown. So we've seen a release of those, and we've started to have some house moves now. The removals are able to work. Surveyors are back in business, so they are able to now go back into properties. So we have seen some movement, but there are difficulties. People are obviously in situations where they don't know where their jobs are, and that we'll have to remain to see where the economy is going to head for people to be in a situation to make those moves now.
So, but there must be a load of practical issues if you're actually looking to exchange or whatever.
There have been. I mean, we've had a range of issues. In a chain of properties trying to move house, we've perhaps had somebody who is an 80-year-old who's been shielding. We've had somebody who wouldn't agree to the kind of remedies that we could really introduce. And the sort of things we could suggest were to have a COVID clause as a rider to a contract, which effectively would allow somebody not to contractually be liable if they couldn't complete on the day that they had previously set for their completion day. So it effectively gave us a bit of a leeway with delay. But what we've got is a scenario, if you think you've got maybe 4 people in a chain, you might have somebody who doesn't want to move by exchanging and completing on the same day. you've got somebody who doesn't want to use the sort of clause remedy. And all in all, you end up with a scenario where we're going round in circles trying to practically get people to a situation where they can all agree on a moving date and actually be able to do that. And up until recently, we had the same issue with trying to get removal companies in place where people couldn't either book removals and certainly couldn't book them far ahead in time. The other practical difficulty we've had is to get signed documentation. As property lawyers, we still need original documents. So people have had to get witnesses to those documents and actually get those documents physically back to us. So all of that has, all in all, caused some practical difficulties. We've had people witnessing documents via Zoom and sort of having neighbours sign things where they've seen people sign things from a distance and then have to step in and sign that document themselves. So all of those practical things have been things that we've had to try and work around to get any of the house moves done that we've been able to do over the last few weeks.
And from the land registry point of view, are they functioning as normally? And if not, is that causing a problem, or is a problem building up there?
They weren't functioning in the same way as usual, but they are back to some working life now. We are getting some movement with that. The land registry did actually relax some of the requirements for what we could do with sending scans of documents to them, so that has helped a little bit. And now that we are completing purchases, we are now able to submit applications to them in the normal way, and that's all now electronically anyway. So yes, they are back up and running, and things are moving, but they certainly have a backlog, and I think that's going to take some time to wash through.
Sure. I mean, to me, it's amazing how the market, there is movement in the market at all, but it's incredible.
Yes.
So presumably viewings, or people just buying things, quick look at the plan, or...
A mixture. Yeah, I think we found it incredible as well, if I'm honest. There have been people who have done online viewings, but do you really want to buy your biggest asset by looking at, camera angles of something? I think it's not ideal. So I think people have initially wanted to see things online, and then they do actually want to go and visit the property before they commit. And the way that's been happening is either with PPE, with the people that own the houses going out of the properties while people do a viewing. Agents can't go round the property with the people wanting to do the viewings. So it's been a range of the online sort of system, plus then a practical visit to the property, but it has to be with social distancing, and there's a numerous kind of cleaning that needs to take place for that to happen. Back-to-back viewings have not been allowed as they normally would have been, because you've got to have this cleaning process in between. So yes, lots of practical issues and lots of, I think, just things that take a lot longer now to affect than they might have done 3-4 months ago.
Sure. So thank you very much for that, Karen. Lucy, if I could turn to you, one of the most difficult things I think for me to think about is this issue of how people's mental capacity, whether it's through age or any other reason, it can be affected. And so I suppose the question is, what measures can be taken? What should people be thinking about in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So any individual who has mental capacity to make decisions about how to plan for potential incapacity can make a key document called a lasting power of attorney. So we call them LPAs for short, and they are an insurance policy, if you like, against losing capacity at some point in your life. So a lot of people tend to think of LPAs being something that older people have when they've lost capacity, and that's absolutely right. But it's absolutely key that we think about them whilst we've got capacity and put that insurance policy in place. There are two types. There is a lasting power of attorney for health and welfare, and there is a lasting power of attorney for property and financial affairs. And our guidance is always to think about both, although I think for a lot of people they tend to think about the property and financial affairs aspect being more important to them. The key thing with a lasting power of attorney is that essentially the person giving it, so you or I, would make our LPA and we would choose, and that's really important, we get the choice as to who would then go on to make decisions about either our property and affairs or our health and welfare. Both potentially whilst we still have capacity, if that's how we want the document to be used, but really keyly, if we were to ever be in a position where we've lost capacity, whether that be temporarily or permanent, that is. So once the document is made, it can only be used once it's been registered with the Office of the Public Guardian, and that's really key, because at the outbreak of COVID, everybody fell into a sense of security. I've got my lasting power of attorney, I've made them, I've forward planned, but unfortunately a lot of people, although they had made the LPAs, they hadn't actually taken that step to register them at the Office of the Public Guardian, and of course therefore they were pretty useless. So again, our advice is, if you're going to make these insurance policies, that you take steps to register them. They don't necessarily have to be used straight away once they're registered, but they are there, they are ready to be used, for example, when incapacity occurs, or just worst case scenario, on a very practical basis, if you are unable to get to the bank, but somebody else is able to get there on your behalf. So essentially, from a practical point of view, lasting powers of attorney will enable you to have the choice as to who you want to make decisions on your behalf. They can be relatively complicated depending on your affairs, and particularly if you want them to be restricted in terms of how your attorneys can use them. One thing we always say is think very carefully about who you're going to appoint as your attorneys. Firstly, if you're going to appoint more than one, make sure that they can get on with one another. It's not always the case, and we do have situations where attorneys, siblings particularly, just cannot work with one another. And the other thing is make sure they're up to the job. There's absolutely no point in appointing an attorney to look after your property and financial affairs if they're simply not able to do so. They don't have the skill set. So if you have assets that may require a particular set of skills, that could be accounting, it could be just having a general very good knowledge of financial affairs, then do think about making sure they've got the right skill set. From a practical point of view as well, they do take 8 to 10 weeks usually to be registered. Obviously, we have seen delays to that. So if you're going to make them now and you're forward planning, get on with it sooner rather than later. And in terms of the health and welfare aspects, they do give your attorney the potential ability to make decisions in respect of life-sustaining treatment. And that's something that, if you have strong wishes, you will certainly want to be making an LPA for health and welfare and thinking about who is going to make those potential choices on your behalf.
Lucy, let me just quickly ask, particularly with the turmoil that we've all had over the last few months, if somebody's been appointed an attorney and for whatever reason feels that they're no longer the right person to do that, is it easy to change? And perhaps that's wrapped up with the same question of the practicalities in terms of documentation, signing, whatever, of putting one in place or changing one.
Yes, absolutely. So whilst the donor, the person who's given the power of attorney, whilst that individual has mental capacity, they can absolutely revoke it, they can change it, and therefore they could change their arrangement of attorneys. What's very important is that if you have registered the LPA, you do need to take additional steps to revoke a registered lasting power of attorney. If you've made your lasting power of attorney but have yet to register it, then it is it is a simpler process, let's put it that way. But whilst the donor has mental capacity, you are absolutely able to revoke or to change your arrangement of who your attorneys are. Unfortunately, if the donor of the power has lost mental capacity and subsequently an attorney appointed under that power is either unable to act or may have even passed away, but for whatever reason, there's a reason they can't act, there may be sufficient arrangements within that power to allow, say, a other individual. So if they are appointed jointly and severally, then the other attorney could act without the attorney who doesn't want to or isn't able to. Or if it is a sole or joint power, if there is a replacement attorney appointed in the power, then the replacement attorney will be able to take over. If there are no sufficient arrangements within the power and it tends to fail ultimately, then unfortunately, if the donor has lost mental capacity and can't then make another power of attorney, it would then be a case of needing to take steps to apply to the Court of Protection to potentially be appointed as that individual's deputy to manage property and affairs, for example.
Right, got you. You can tell I'm very hung up on the practicalities of how you get all this stuff done. So, Melissa, if somebody dies and a grant of probate is needed, how long is that now taking?
So on our theory topic of making sure you've got wills to protect you and LPAs to deal with assets or issues in your lifetime, obviously when somebody dies, there is a procedure that has to be followed in terms of reporting to the revenue in order to be issued with a grant of probate, which is the document that allows the executors, for example, to sell a house or to realise investments and to deal with the distribution to beneficiaries. We would normally expect a standard application from the time that somebody dies to the time that we have a grant of probate and we can distribute assets to take a minimum of 6 months. But from the time that you apply for the grant of probate, it's usually probably an 8-week process. At the moment, from the time we apply for the grant of probate itself, it's taking probably 12 to 16 weeks at a minimum. And that's if we can actually apply for the grant of probate relatively quickly, because we need valuations of all the assets, and that includes properties, for example. If you need to have a property valuation carried out, you go back to Karen's issue of somebody being able to visit the property to ascertain the value of it. So everything is taking longer. It takes longer for the death certificate to be issued because of the volume that have had to be dealt with in the last few months. It takes longer to compile the information to actually apply. And then there is a backlog, both at HMRC and at the probate registries. So you can basically assume that your process has doubled in length at the moment.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and as you say, Karen talked about the difficulties of getting a valuation for a sale or any other purpose. But actually, that makes me think, Karen, it's not particularly a legal question, but are your view of the market from where you sit, are you seeing that values have plummeted or what?
I think initially, even a couple of weeks ago, as this sort of sprung back to life, we thought there were going to be lots of if we call them price chips, so where people had already got an ongoing transaction and just before they were ready to exchange contracts, they thought they could use the situation, I suppose, to get a reduction in price. Initially, that was definitely conversations that we were having, but I would say that that's not actually come to fruition. I've actually even had somebody who's been gazumped on a £3 million property.
Wasn't me.
No, it wasn't me either. Thinking that there would be, some price reduction on that sort of value of property, and actually someone was prepared to pay more. So at the moment, I'd say it hasn't really come to that. But what we have seen is, that there are moves by certain mortgage lenders. For example, they've made it harder for first-time buyers. So there's an 85% loan-to-value ratio that Nationwide have brought in for first-time buyers. So effectively, they need a much larger deposit. That, to me, shows that they think there's a nervousness about where the market is actually going to head. And, if the lenders are taking those sorts of steps, then it's just, I think we've probably got to have a watching brief. But at the moment, no, there haven't been really significant price changes, although I have to say, quite surprised myself that that's not where it's headed. It perhaps is not the case in central London, where sort of prime central London properties are obviously at a premium. But we've actually seen people refinancing those properties to help with their businesses, that sort of thing, where they've previously not had a mortgage. So I've been doing that sort of work where people are putting mortgages onto properties where they previously haven't had one. So I think London is always a particular market in itself. But generally across the country at the moment, things are holding firm, and most of the transactions that we had that we, if we call it effectively, had been put on ice, have sprung back to life. And yesterday, a couple of chains that I'm dealing with have actually resurrected. So yeah, good signs at the moment.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you, you three. Thank you very much indeed. I think you've given us a very good steer as to what the things that we should be putting in place in terms of the documentation for our own protection of our families. Very interesting to hear your observations and insights on what's going on at the moment. I would add to everybody, let me repeat, that's an overview, general overview that applicable to everybody, but terribly conscious that each one of us will have issues particular to ourselves and our families. So please do feel free to get in touch with any of our panelists. I'll be more than happy just to have a one-on-one conversation with you on anything that's particularly of importance to you. So that's great. Thank you very much, Melissa, Lucy, Karen. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us. And goodbye for now.